This video is a part 2 of an introduction to VBA in Excel. In this video, we're going to cover selecting ranges, both single cell and multi-cell. So you can see here I have a data set of loan records, and we want to start out by selecting just single cells at random within this data set. So the first thing we need to do is go into the VBA editor window. You can do that by clicking on your developer ribbon up top and clicking Visual Basic or hitting Alt F11. Anywhere in this project window, I'm going to right click, go to Insert, and then Module. We'll call this module Ranges. And we'll begin with the keyword sub for subroutine, and we'll call this first subroutine single cell ranges. So you'll find in VBA there's almost always more than one way to do something, and that is the case here with selecting a range. So the first method we covered in the previous video, which is the range object. And then in parentheses, you reference the cell you want to select. In this case, we'll select cell B5, hit a full stop, and then we get a list of additional options, and we'll start typing the keyword select, and you can see there's a select method, so I'll hit tab to pull that in. I'll hit play, and this will select cell B5, and there it is. So in our next method, we're going to use the cells property, which has a row input and a column input as numbers. So if we wanted to select cell C6, we would put 6 for our row input and 3 for our column input. Then again, type the keyword select. So I'll F8 through this to execute one line of code at a time. B5 is already selected, so this will not look like it's doing anything. But then this line of code should select cell C6, and it does. So finally, there's a bit of a shorthand way for selecting ranges. You can enclose your range reference in a set of brackets. So if we wanted to select D7, could place it in a set of brackets and select. So I'll F8 through this. There's B5, there's C6, and there is D7. Easy enough. So now we're going to jump to multi-cell ranges. So I'm going to add a new subroutine. We'll call this Multicell Ranges. And we'll begin with the range object again. And this is really no different than inputting a range like you would in a formula on your spreadsheet. So I reference the top end and then the bottom end of my range. So if we wanted to do B2 to D7, do it like so with the keyword select. And there it is. We can do the range object again in a slightly different way. So we could do something like C8 enclosed in its own set of double quotes, and then a comma to separate the bottom end of your range. So we'll do C8 to D12. And F8 through this, and there it is. And then again, we have our shorthand method to enclose the range in a set of brackets. So we'll do B11 to D18. We'll F8 through this. Now, one thing I'll mention, and this is kind of getting a little bit ahead of things, but in most cases, using the select method is not necessary. You can do it, but it ends up being an unnecessary step. Like, for example, if we want to copy a range of cells, you would simply reference the range in the range object and then use the copy method. Inserting the select in between the range and the copy is really like an unnecessary step. But doing these exercises is just good to get a feel for how to target ranges. So I think this is still worthwhile, and there are instances where you might actually need to select something. So it is good to know. So now we're going to move on to selecting ranges and cells in a more dynamic way. So what I mean by that is, if you've ever been on your spreadsheet and you've had a data set, what we want to do is the equivalent of shortcut keys like control down arrow. I'm currently in cell B1 and I hit control down arrow. It takes us down to the last cell in column B that contains values. If I hit control right arrow, it takes us to the last column in that row that contains values. We want to do similar things in VBA. So I'm going to add a new subroutine we'll call direction. And we'll begin again with our range object and just reference cell B1. And we're going to look for the end property. And once you hit tab and add a parentheses, there are, let me do that again, I probably couldn't see that. There's 4 options there. You can go down, to the left, to the right, or up. So in this case, we're going to go down, and then we're going to select. So when I run this, what we should see is our cell B19 get activated. And there it is. So we can do a similar thing and just end XL to the right. So even though the active cell is B19, this should take us to cell D1. Why? Because our starting point in our code is cell B1. So I'll F8 through this again. Nothing will happen in this first line. But then when I execute this, we should see this cell, or I should say the selected cell, move to D1. And there it is. So now we want to expand upon what we've just done. So back on our data set, this time I'm in cell B1, and instead of hitting control down arrow, I hit control shift down arrow. That will select everything from cell B1 all the way to the last row that has values. If I hit control shift right arrow from there, it will select the last column that contains values in that data set. We want to do similar things in our code, and you'll find that this is the kind of stuff that does come in handy when you want to copy data sets from one worksheet to another and things of that nature. So similar to what we did earlier, I'm going to start out with a range reference to B1. And this time we're going to have a second input for our range, and it's actually going to be another range reference. Also going to be B1, but the second range reference is actually going to be the bottom end of our range that is dynamic. So we're going to use the end XL down to start with, and select that, and this should select everything from B1 all the way down to B19. So I'll F8 through this, and what we should see now is all of column B that has data selected, and it is. So now we want to modify that so that it captures all of column B as well as C and D for anything that has data. So I'm just going to add on to that end XL to the right. So we'll F8 through this again, and this time we should see our entire data set get selected, and there it is. Now, having said that, there's a much easier way to do what we just did in this line of code here, so don't hate me, but it's good to know the different approaches. So what we can do is refer to any cell in our data set, so I can just pick one at random, maybe C3, and use the current region and then select. And this will select all of the adjacent cells to our range object. So I'll F8 through these lines again. And once I execute this, what you should see is our entire data set get selected. And there it is. Much easier. But it's always good to know the different ways you can get to the same result.